Ladies and gentlemen, Marsh Davis.
Thank you, James. Believe it or not, we were in college together, but he looks about 20 years younger than I do, so amazingly well preserved. Well, it's a rare day indeed when historic preservationists have the pleasure of recognizing a living architect for his or her works upon reaching that magical age of 50, when things somehow become eligible for historic designation. Well, that day has arrived in Indianapolis as we celebrate the work of Evans Woollen and the now 51-year-old Clowes Memorial Hall. Evans, your work continues to stimulate and to challenge, and some would say even still provoke. But in the process, our city and our state have been greatly enriched. Your works may be aging, but they're not aged, and they certainly are not quaint, as many historic buildings are. Let me put this into perspective. When James Kramer and I were wee lads here at Butler in the late 1970s, Butler's Jordan Hall turned 50. Jordan Hall was an old building. It seemed old, it felt old, it was creaky and old, it was ancient, and it was only 50 years old. Well, here we are today, and Clowes Hall, in contrast, being 51 years old, remains remarkably fresh and surprisingly modern. You've left a great body of material for preservationists of the future to cherish and to vigorously defend. And for us in the present, we need to act in our time to prevent any further diminution of that legacy. Evans, I don't have any official citation or commendation to present, but if I did, to borrow from our friends at the Indiana Historical Society, it would be to declare you a living landmark, historic or otherwise. But that's something that I think is perhaps best reserved for your buildings. A more fitting tribute is for us to do our very best to protect and celebrate the remarkable places that you have built. To that end, Indiana Landmarks, through its Indiana Modern Committee, which is chaired by Drew Wright, my colleague here, Indiana Landmarks hereby offers, and this is contingent upon the blessing of President Danko and the Board of Trustees of Butler University, we offer to initiate the nomination of Clowes Memorial Hall to the National Register of Historic Places. Yeah. But thereby adding it to the distinguished roster, which includes Jordan Hall and Hinkle Fieldhouse. It's a fitting recognition of the building's architectural significance and its historic impact on the cultural life of this community. And lastly, Evans, thank you for sticking it out in Indiana as long as you did, when your career could have taken you just about anywhere in the world. Thank you for being
50 years.
Good. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to my friend, mentor, scholar, AIA fellow, theoretically retired professor of architecture at Ball State, and now the director of Columbus, Indiana Architectural Archives, Tony Costello. Tony?
Thank you, Marsh. It's one of the great things about having been at Ball State for 46 years is that I get to associate with former students and now professional colleagues, and it's just it's a wonderful, wonderful reward that I feel very blessed to have. We want this to be a discussion. I know it's been billed as that, and we really want you to feel like this is kind of like a fireside chat. We know there's a lot of people here. We're going to try to move this along rather quickly. We are going to obviously ask some questions between ourselves and have dialogue, but we certainly invite the audience to ask questions, which you may of any one of the panelists directly, or if it's a general question, I may direct that to a particular panelist that I feel might be the most able to answer that. We also hope there's going to be dialogue, indeed debate between some of the panelists up here. If Evans Woollen's architecture doesn't do that, I'm not sure if this has been a very successful discussion. The only thing I do ask about questions is please keep them brief. We've already got 3 panelists. We really don't want to add another one. With that as a introduction, it's my honor to introduce the 3 participants. To my extreme right is Mary Ellen Gatsky. She is a former employee of Woollen Molzan in the mid-'80s. She holds a master's degree from the College of Architecture at Cornell University in New York. She was the primary researcher and writer for the 1994 film Building for Meaning, The Architecture of Evans Woollen, that was aired on many PBS stations nationwide. She also was the curator for the exhibit, the I'm Mocha exhibit that you see upstairs, certainly I recommend, if you didn't have a chance before the discussion, to avail yourselves to look at the photographs. And as was pointed out so ably by the young gentleman that took the tour before the discussion, you'll also see photographs by some of the most noted photographers of modern architecture, such as Balthazar Korab. The second person I'd like to introduce, and by the way, this goes in alphabetical order, and Drew, I'm not sure if how many times you've not been last with the name White, but my dictionary says that comes before Woollen. Drew White is a fellow of the AIA. He is also a founding partner of Axis Architecture and Interiors. Did his undergraduate work at Ohio State University and graduate work at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I've had the pleasure to know Drew and have been here long enough to see his firm formed and to grow. I used to tell people, especially my students looking for internships, well, there's this firm, Axis Architecture and Interiors, an up-and-coming young firm that focuses on design. Now I don't do that. Now I basically say a very well-established firm that have won over 30 AIA design awards, state and local and regional level, his firm is considered literally to be one of the firms at the vanguard of modernist design today. He is currently doing projects in Columbus, Indiana, and it is a great pleasure to have Drew here again. Certainly one of the foremost up-and-coming architects. The third person, of course, is why I'm sure you're all here. Of course, that is Evans Woollen, born and raised in Indianapolis. And interestingly enough, while I was researching Evans Woollen and pulled it up on the website, his grandfather came up first, which I guess is logical, chronologically.
Same name.
Same name, and of course the same name as his father. And that put the connection together with Evans and going to Yale University to get a BA degree from Yale College and then a master's in architecture from Yale University, where Philip Johnson actually was one of his instructors. He adds John Johansson never was one of his instructors because John Johansson never taught at Yale. But maybe even more importantly, his thesis critic was the very famous Lou Kahn. Obviously, I think Lou Kahn needs no further explanation other than to say, as we talk about theaters, if you're ever in Fort Wayne, I would certainly recommend that you visit Lou Kahn's theater there. As was mentioned, and by the way, Evans also worked upon graduation for Philip Johnson in New Canaan, Connecticut, where they both were. He returned in '55 to start his own office, and I think he mentions a postage-size office. I remember coming here. Were you under the big 7-Up sign?
That was later.
Oh, that was later. That was the larger office.
That was expansive. The first office was in the old insurance building on the Circle, where the Chase Bank now is, and I was on the 5th floor in the end of a corridor which had been a cleaning closet up until then. It had one glorious, tall, double-hung window looking onto the fountain of the Circle, and otherwise there was just room for my drawing board and and my own chair and a seat for a missing client.
The great thing about that is it can be a very small chair taking up very little room, I guess. I think many of you know, and certainly not being from here, but being from New York and actually being educated in the early 60s at both Pratt and Columbia and following, obviously, architecture from that point on. When I came out here in 1967, there were two gentlemen older than I was, which everybody was at that time. I considered the senior statesman of architecture to be Mr. Ewing Miller from Terre Haute, and then the junior, if I may say that, architecture avant-garde leader, Mr. Evans Woollen. And I followed Evans' career. I was privileged to actually team teach an urban design studio with Evans in 1970, and it's interesting how circles meet. It was for a project in South Bend called Michiana Place, which is now Century Center, done by Philip Johnson. So there is this kind of thread throughout things. We're going to continue with the discussion now because I don't think Evans needs any further. I'm going to ask the first question as one of my perks for being the moderator, and it's a question that I would think probably one of my students would ask when a speaker typically says, "Are there any questions?" And that is, what made you become an architect, or who inspired you to become an architect?
I don't have to use this.
Oh, okay.
I was told that.
Oh, you've got.
That I am.
We know who the main speaker is.
My hands are free for gestures.
Okay. And you're not Italian.
Oh, I am. Yes. Yes. I quickly admit to that. I hope we can go through this quickly and get to the parts that are more interesting to you. But I decided to be an architect in the sand pile. And when I must have been 4 or 5, and people would pass the sand pile and say, "He's going to be an architect." and I thought, yeah, that's right. And then if I was missing in the house and people couldn't find me, they'd always just go to the sand pile because I was there making buildings. And towns and so forth. So that's how it all began. But I do have to say a word about my grandfather, Evans Woollen. When I was 12, 11, 12, 13, I was doing a lot of drawings and drawings of houses and other buildings. And my parents were rather bored by this, but my grandfather was always looking over my shoulder and was interested and encouraged me to be an architect. My father did not encourage me because he'd seen too many architects fail in the Great Depression, and he did not want me to be begging on the streets. And so I owe some great debt to Evans Woollen Sr.
Great. And I know he's looking down this evening with a big smile on his face also. I think one of the questions that certainly is on everybody's mind concerning Clowes Hall is the relationship of you and John Johansson in association, obviously. And I'd like to start.
If you will stop talking, I will tell about that. Yeah. I mean, we've used that.
Expect anything less from Evans?
Many of you have heard this story, I guess, through the Channel 20 film and so forth, and maybe other sources. So forgive me for repeating it. But in 1960. Alan Clowes approached me. We were friends. We were new friends. I did not know Alan growing up because he was a good deal older than I was. But my parents knew Dr. Clowes and Mrs. Clowes, and my grandfather knew the Clowes too through the art museum. So Alan and I became friends when I moved back to Indianapolis in 1955. And he approached me and said, we are going to build a concert hall / theater. And are you interested? And I said, of course, I was interested. And would you like to be interviewed? And I said, yes, I would like to be interviewed. And then I thought about what the situation was. We knew that they were going to be interviewing some big-time out-of-state architects. And it occurred to me to ask my friend, Joe Johansson, whom I had known in New Canaan, not because I was working for him, but because I was working for, initially when I got out of Yale, I was working for an architect named Landis Gores. And both Joe and Landis shared the upper story of a building on the main street of New Canaan, and a two-story building, and it was a big long room, and Landis and I were in one end of the room, and Joe and a employee of his were in the other end. So we saw each other a great deal, had lunch together. We're constantly making jokes from one end of the room to the other. And when I left New Canaan in 1955, Joe was certainly my best friend in New Canaan, and I kept in touch with him. And so after Alan's comment about do you want to be considered, I felt that it would be good to have a partner, an equal partner. And I went to Joe and found out that Joe and Alan had been classmates at Harvard, but did not know each other because the class was so big. But they shared the same year as undergraduates at Harvard. And I thought, well, that's helpful. And so Joe hadn't done a theater either. He really hadn't done anything except houses. And they were wonderful houses, and I greatly admired them and saw them going up when I lived in New Canaan. And I did actually 3 houses of my own during that time, too. So I got in touch with him and said, would you like to join me in this, to be considered in this effort? And he said yes, he would, and he pleaded that he didn't have any theater experience, and I said, well, neither do I. We're just going to be winging it. And and I said, I think the best thing we can do is to assemble a team of expert consultants so that we do not look so inexperienced. And he rather agreed. And he was excited about coming out to Indianapolis because both his father and mother were well-known painters in their day. And they had become very close friends of Miss Lucy Taggart of Indianapolis, who was also a painter. And he remembered in childhood Miss Lucy, and he was hoping to see her again. So he appeared for the interview, and the interview just before us was Eero Saarinen, and with wonderful experience. He had finished one of the great theaters in Lincoln Center. And Mr. Saarinen was in a hurry. He was late for a jury for the Sydney Opera House. And he was very interested in the Sydney Opera House. And he came, and throughout the interview, he kept looking at his watch because he had a plane to catch to get to Sydney, eventually to get to Sydney. And Mrs. Clowes, who was, of course, a prime factor, probably the prime factor, and she was annoyed at his anxiety to leave. She wanted to get as much out of him as possible. And the looking at the clock, which of course was a great lesson for me, never to look at the clock again, was distasteful to her. And as we later heard it from Alan, was the principal reason, can you believe it, that Eero Saarinen was not chosen. And we came in afterwards, and without watches, and were apparently ingratiating to Mrs. Clowes, who was well known in Indianapolis as the Duchess, which gives you an idea. She was a wonderful woman, but she was a grande dame, and so we came in and we presented ourselves as equal partners in every aspect of the work, and then we presented the people that would be with us, and they were Jean Rosenthal of New York City, who was the greatest theater lighting designer of her time, and also a general authority on theaters and how they worked. Backstage, she ran a business called the Theater Production Service, and I first knew her when I was at Hotchkiss, because the Hotchkiss Dramat bought their sets and their canvases from Jeannie Rosenthal, and I was an incurable ham actor at school, and so I nudged my way in to meet her, and it was really quite amusing that all those years later I was able to call on her as our consultant. Ben Schlanger, who did the seating, he was an expert on sightlines and seating, and convinced us to do the Continental seating. He had done the seating for all the theaters in Lincoln Center and in New York, which preceded us by 2 or 3 years. And then Richard Kelly was the most brilliant architectural lighting consultant of the time, and he did what has now been almost erased. The beautiful, you can see it in photographs of the theater, which are not in the exhibit. But he did the lighting of the sides of the hall, the white walls, which I guess have disappeared, and the wash lights that went all the way down the side walls. And so the inside of the house, when it was new, was like a great lantern, and beautiful to photograph and beautiful to be in. And finally, in terms of the major consultants, we had Robert Newman of Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, and they had done some of the Lincoln Center theaters. And I first met Robert Newman when I was an undergraduate, not an undergraduate, when I was in architecture school at Yale, and he came to talk, and we had a party for him afterwards, and I found him so engaging and interesting, and we became friends at that time. So, like Jean Rosenthal, it was wonderful to call him up and say, I haven't seen you for a few years, but we have a possibility here. Would you present your credentials and so forth? He didn't come to the interview, but we had all their catalogs and all their background and so forth. So I like to think that those 4 people helped us enormously, and we have no record of what Arrow said in terms of his consultants and so forth. I have, of course, the greatest respect for Arrow Saarinen. He was the architect of his era, and he deserved to do this building, but it didn't happen that way. And I've often thought that the commissions I got in later professional life were never logical. They were always, it was always some sort of quirky thing that made it possible. And other architects may find that true too. I don't.
Well, actually, I don't know how to do this with any sort of decorum. But if we could move along.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Drew, I think you heard Mr. Woollen, Evans talk about this notion of out-of-town architects. And we know, of course, Columbus is world famous for bringing in, quote, out-of-town nationally significant architects. As a practicing architect who obviously is being invited to interview for projects or you're going out, how do you view the idea that Indianapolis still has some of its major projects hire out-of-state architects as the principal architect?
Well, I think that stinks. I could probably spend all my waking hours thinking about ways that a local Indianapolis architect can gain a commission by teaming with I don't know if it's working or not. Is it?
Twist at the bottom.
Okay.
Well, just shout.
By teaming with a, let's say, international or national architect. And we've had so many defeats at the zoo, at Purdue University, at Indiana University, with many clients, thinking that if we brought a large architect in with us to win a project that we would win. And what we have found recently is that we're better off going in by ourselves as a great local architect. So that's our new rationale in gaining work. Recently, we interviewed for the new downtown transit center against some great firms, including Daniel Liebeskin with Air Partners. And we put together a team that includes URS. Now, I will admit they have an international, well, I guess a national office, but they do also have a local office. One of their specialties is transit design. We have zero transit experience. And I will tell you, I did call one of my best friends, an ex-SOMer who works in Shanghai now, and said, Corey, will you be on our team? This is AECOM. And he said, Drew, it's a damn bus stop. You guys can do this project. So we assembled a team of local consultants, including Rundell, Ernstberger, and Associates, the designers of the Cultural Trail. As I mentioned, URS has the international transit experience. So we go in for the interview. We're excited about ourselves. We did a great job, and we came in second place. 2 months later, we get a call from Indigo, and I don't know how this happened, but Liebeskin and Eric could not come to an agreement on their contract. So for once in my life, finishing second is not time for last. It's time for first. So we were called in, we negotiated our agreement, and we're doing a wonderful job on the design. And so I think the lesson learned is we local architects are good architects, and we can do a great job, and we don't necessarily need to bring in some big high-style guy, especially if it's just a bus stop.
I have a story about the construction that I think is important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Would you like me to give you a time limit?
No. You can just do this.
Okay. Okay. That's what I'm afraid. James is going to do to me here. Mary Ellen, any questions for Evans that are on a totally different topic?
They're follow-ups.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Does this work? Testing, testing? Okay, great. One thing I did want to point out, Evans, you may have missed it, but there is a great interior photo of Clowes upstairs in the lobby. It was in the IMOCA exhibit a few years ago, and it does show what you were trying to convey about the wall washing and the beautiful white wall. So if you missed it, this is what Evans is talking about. When you're leaving, it's just to the right of the doors. And another follow-up, I know that Joe Johansson died about a year and a half ago, and I think you maintained your friendship, but I didn't know if you ever had teamed up again, perhaps for maybe a competition we don't know about.
No.
No.
Philosophically, our practices after Clowes verged somewhat. I was very interested, indeed I was interested when we were jointly designing Clowes, interested in the ethos of the place where the building was. Joe was not really taken with that. I wanted to see a building that had some relationship with Jordan Hall, that's how the verticality evolved in the design. Joe, of course, was interested in new forms that really hadn't been seen before, and he became, after we designed Clowes Hall together, he became very interested in Marshall McLuhan, and somehow Marshall McLuhan had got him started on buildings that plugged in, that had parts that plugged into each other like electronic systems, and the Mummers Theater, for example,
Oklahoma City, right?
And even this school in Columbus. I admired all of that, but I was in another situation because of my geographic location, because of the kind of clients that I had. I approached each project with the idea of that it was growing upon the seeds of what was there. And in fact, David Lewis taught us to go and live with the clients before we drew any lines. And Joe just was on a different tack, not totally different at all. I admired what was going on, but I think that was the principal reason we didn't come back together. I do want to tell the story before it's too late of what happened during the construction of Clowes Hall, and it's sort of shocking, but it's kind of confessional or something about it, that we had hired a very well-known mechanical engineer from Hartford, Connecticut, and I knew him, and he had a big firm. None of these people will have names, and he had done a lot of work and was experienced, and he was a good choice. But he convinced us that he should do this structure too, and that he had a new man in his firm to do the structure, and that it would cut the fees down if they were able to do both of them. Well, the working drawings were finished, and the building was begun by George Barr, the contractor, and it wasn't very far along when George Barr came to me and told me that there was something wrong with the structural plans, with the structural design. And then a local engineer named George Fink, whom I admired enormously, came in and examined the plans, and he said, there is too much steel in the plans, but there are a few places where there's too little and the plans are not competent. And so we went to our building committee, headed by Kurt Ponser, Sr. Kurt Ponser III, I believe, is in the audience. So this is for him. And we told them, frankly, what had happened. And we got their agreement to shut the job down until George Fink could do new structural plans. And the bidding had already been done. And so we had a redesign period, and then we had to have it rebid. And the miraculous thing that, I cannot believe even today, was because the incompetent structural engineer had put so much steel in that the contractor was able to subtract that from the bid, and we came out even with the lost time and the inefficiencies. But I had to shield Butler from the press, from my friends, from everybody who drove by and said, nothing's happening. Why isn't the building going on? And I would say, oh, I don't know. There's some delays, but
I think for any architects out there, I think this is a great example of a deduct alternate that seemed to work really well. So that I am not accused of going back on my word, we'd love to take a question for anybody from the audience. Yes, sir.
Thank you for this incredible building. I'm celebrating my 50th anniversary with it as well. What I remember most, having come to hundreds of events here, is the feeling of being in that magnificent hall many years ago. The textures, the concrete, that fabulous, the carpet, the curtain. And I've been watching Clowes over the last few years, and I'm looking at the walls, and I'm looking at what passes for carpeting. My question is simple: what the hell?
you're speaking of the carpeting that you now see.
And the walls as well.
And the walls.
Yes.
And
it's not the hall I grew up in.
I can tell you that in the 50 years that has intervened since the building that we're talking about tonight, Butler University never called us once for the fleeting advice on anything in the building. So I can't say anything about the incredibly bad carpet.
And I will bet that Butler University never called you before they built that building that obscures your magnificent building.
No, they just didn't have our telephone number.
I think that is just a sacrilege to have covered up this magnificent.
It wasn't any enmity. I know.
They probably
It just never occurred to them that I could be helpful, that I was, a few blocks away.
Well, I drove up. I haven't been in the building for quite a while. I drove up to get my ticket yesterday, and I thought, where am I? I can't see Clowes Hall. You can't see it from the street anymore. I just wanted to cry. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Since this is here.
Yeah.
Okay. Mention was made just a little bit ago, and I have to say it was the exact opposite of what you did. And that's with regard to the Fort Wayne Fine Arts Center. I was on the board of the Civic Theater for 12 years, 6 years treasurer, 2 as president. Working with Lou Kahn was the worst thing you could have imagined. His original plans were totally unusable. He did not have a single theater consultant. None. It could not be used as a theater. It took extra years. It almost got scrapped. He almost got fired. And no matter what it looks like now, It doesn't compare to this. And it doesn't compare to this with regard to usability as a theater. It was one of the, it finally got there. It took at least 2 extra years to get it built. And all sorts of knockdown, yelling battles with him before it got built.
Well, I can relate to this. I think one of the greatest compliments to any professor is when a student outdoes you. I don't know if you got that. Okay. You're a tough crowd, I'll tell you, boy. You know, I also understand that it was quite dramatic when the first double T was lifted and split in the middle and shot concrete about 1/4 mile over Fort Wayne.
Yes.
Any other another question? Oh, hold on, yeah.
Mr. Woollen, I know that Yamasaki's library was going up around the same time, and I'm
No,
wondering-
it was slightly earlier,
It was a little earlier.
and we referred to it as My Funny Valentine.
Very nice. So I was wondering if you ever met him and what you thought of the building.
Oh, I had a very, very awesome meeting with him at the behest of the Butler trustees. The Butler trustees, in their great wisdom, decided that I should go and talk to Yamasaki about where Clowes Hall should be located. We knew where we thought it should be located, and it told the trustees that. But they thought I should test this out with Yamasaki. And so I made a trip to Bloomfield Hills. And I was ushered into his presence. And he was sitting on a dais. And I was offered a pillow to sit on. And then tea was served to him, but not to me. And I asked the critical question, do you approve of where we would put Clowes Hall? And he said no. He said, libraries belong in the center, theaters belong on the fringe. And it's too close to the center of the future campus. And thumbs down.
Gee, I just hate to use this comment, but it's interesting who got the last laugh on that one. Any other questions before I... Yeah.
I wonder if there was any element of architecture or design that you wish you could have added to Clowes Hall after it was already constructed, or if there was something that may have gotten shut down in your plans that you wish had been a part of it.
No. There was nothing that either of us really wanted to change. The head of the building committee, Kurt Ponser, told us that he was going to solicit a fund to paint all the concrete on the inside gold. And somehow he had no luck with that, as you can see.
You know, I've learned something from Evans. If you really want to make a point, you stand up, actually, evidently. I didn't know that in my public speaking class. But, Mary Ellen, you've done a lot of research on Evans.
I want to look in the eyes of the questioner. That's why I stood up.
You've done a lot of research on Evans, and we know that Evans has some other buildings here in Indianapolis. One that I'm thinking about that fortunately has been restored by the GSA and dealt with things like handicap accessibility, and I'm sure, but the federal building, which again, in my mind, for the Midwest, was a pretty, what should I say, brave move on the part of Evans. In your research, what did you find out, or what have you heard concerning that building?
I think we're going to talk about Clowes tonight, Tony.
Okay, well, I was just wondering about another building.
Good for you. Good for you.
But I do think that the boldness of Clowes did pave the way for buildings like the Federal Building and St. Thomas Aquinas Church, and true landmarks in this community that did not follow the conventional paths. So I think Clowes had an influence in that. But I did want to ask a question about the lobby, because I know that you devoted a great deal of thought to expanding it and making it more of a place for theater goers to meet during intermission and so forth. It's kind of a long-held tradition in Europe that people come out during intermission, see one another, walk around. But theaters in the U.S. until maybe the early 60s had kind of skimpy lobbies, and I know that you were interested in correcting that.
I'm so glad you mentioned that.
And just one point that I have is that I don't know of any theater where there are balconies in the lobby. And that's balconies where you can look down on the house, who's shown up on the main floor and so forth. It's just such an entertaining part of Clowes. I think people look forward to going out in intermission. So tell us more about that.
Well, theaters in the U.S. up until Lincoln Center were very skimpy on balconies. And they didn't honor the European custom. In Europe, people link arms, and maybe 4 or 5 or 6 people are walking in linked arms in the balcony. And they walk and they have drinks and they look at each other and so forth. And we wanted to recreate that atmosphere. And of course, Lincoln Center had paved the way for us to some degree, but not to the degree of wrapping around the whole house the way our lobby did. We gave the customers a longer walk than the Metropolitan Opera, for example.
Drew, would you have another question that you would like to?
You know, as architects, we're trained to talk to our clients about big ideas for our projects, and be interested to know for you, Evans, when you presented this design to the review committee, were there other design ideas about this theater, or did you hone in on one big concept for this project? How'd you deliver the message?
We presented this design in a model, and it was well received, I believe, but Mrs. Clowes said she would like to see something more akin to the Lincoln Center buildings. She was having a classical moment. And so we did do a design with this program. It was just a rendering, and God knows where the rendering now is. I think it was given to Butler, and there was only one copy, and we were less careful about saving copies of everything in those days. And we did a rendering, and it was had columns on three sides, and it was just too much like Lincoln Center, and not enough like the Butler campus. And we again advanced the argument of Jordan Hall and trying to get something homogeneous in terms of the total architecture of the campus. And she decided we were right. But she wanted us to go through that exercise, and we did it. And we could have resisted, and I look back and think that it was much wiser to have done the rendering and faced the possibility that she would choose it.
Evans, tell us about the continental seating, the fire codes, and the requirements for exits every 15 feet, and how that changed the exterior of the building.
Well, you lead me into a really interesting question, and that is that Robert Newman, the acoustician, told us very early, before there was any real plan for the building. He said, I want to see the sides of the hall fractured into parallel panels. I want to see them like that, and that will give us the kind of acoustics, the best acoustics that I can provide. And so we ran with that. That was the inspiration of the module, and we decided that since it was what was really called for the house itself, should be applied to the whole building, and so that scale, which stems from the acoustical needs, became the theme of the exterior of the building, too. Plus the wanting to make it belong to the spirit of the place.
I might just add something, Evans, and I've always held you in great respect, but that has been up one notch. I don't know how many times an architect would ever give an engineer laudatory terms about being part of the concept of a building. I just want to so it really does say something
just
about your
let me tell you that anybody who does
professionalism.
a theater better damn well be obey the acoustician, or he's in for or she is in for real troubles.
Well,
no, we made a god out of Robert Newman.
Well, and if anybody wants to have another testament to what Evans just said, I'm not sure what the running bill is now, but over the years, the retrofitting of the performance spaces at Lincoln Center has got to be in the billions of dollars with a B. Every one of those halls, one of them twice, has had to be totally redesigned in order to bring the acoustics up to bare minimum standards. We're not talking about La Scala. We're talking about...
It's the Philharmonic Hall.
Right. Yeah. So that the conductors who conduct there, say, well, at least it's acceptable, because for many years, for them, it was one of the most horrible places. And as you well know, New York does not like to have anything in their city called horrible. Okay, Drew, and I think we might have to be wrapping this up. So do you have some closing...
I just wanted to ask one question, if I can. Evans, for a lot of us younger architects in the crowd and myself, think that your earlier work, I know Marilyn wants to stay on Clowes, but I really wanted to bring this up. Your earlier work as a residential architect, the houses that you designed here in Indianapolis, for a lot of us, are very mysterious. They're inspiring, they're stimulating, even to today. Even for me in our practice. And I'm wondering, when you started out doing these small projects for younger couples, how you were able to jump from residential scale work with wood materials to a project like this or like the Federal Building. How were you able to do that?
Wasn't easy. I mean, we had to learn very quickly, and sometimes raggedly, but we did. And I loved doing those houses. And then as we got bigger projects, there was a long period where I didn't have time to do any houses. And then we got to a kind of final phase of our practice where we were able to do bigger projects and houses, or felt right about that at the same time. But the Liebmans are here, and they have an early house, the Round House, and looking back on it, it's incredible what those clients got for the dollar.
One of the things I believe this is true, I believe Evans has a dinner reservation at 8:45 and said that he would walk out of here in order to make that reservation. I only ask one thing of myself, and this goes to James. Could you send home a note to my wife as to why I have a Tommy Tippy cup? Because with rum and coke in it, by the way, because she's going to want to know what I've been doing this evening. I just want to, on behalf of all the panelists and obviously Mr. Evans Woollen, I just want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. It's not the best weather. I think all of you, in my mind, have shown a tremendous respect and appreciation for the work of Evans Woollen. The beauty is that it's going to be here at least for another 100 years. So if we could all give Evans a great round of applause.